Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 6 of the Star Wisdom astrology course, which is going to be taught by the moon. And this is my moon hat. Now, interestingly, the moon at one level is very much about our history and our roots and the unconscious and where we've come from. And this hat has quite an interesting provenance. So inside the headband, there's a label that says fashioned by Huboni's Headwear, 47 Beeston Street, Kingston, Jamaica. And I found it in a charity shop in an area where there's quite a lot of West Indian people living. And I can imagine that a woman came over from the West Indies, possibly on the Windrush, and she brought this hat with her. Maybe it was her best Sunday hat or a wedding hat. And it ended up in the charity shop because maybe she had died or she had to move into a care home or whatever and had to clear out her stuff. So I love the fact that this hat has a history to it, has a story attached to it. And that's very much what the moon is about, because it's about our emotions. It's about our emotional being. So as you probably all realize, the moon takes a month to go through the entire zodiac. It spends about 2.5 days in each sign, so it moves very quickly. And obviously every month we have a full moon and we have a new moon, and the energy waxes and wanes. Of course, the moon rules the tides, it rules women's hormones. And any hospital will tell you, any hospital A&E will tell you that on the full moon, they tend to be busier than at other times because there's like this heightened energy. And of course, the full moon, what that means is that the sun and the moon are absolutely opposite each other, because the moon doesn't have any light of its own. It can only reflect the light of the sun. So it only looks full when it is opposite the sun and the sun is completely illuminating it. Once the moon starts to move away, the sun is only illuminating part of it. And therefore, we only see a half moon. And by the time it gets round to the new moon, the dark moon, we don't see the moon at all. So in the chart, the moon represents our emotions, how we operate at an emotional level. And it's really useful to know, particularly in families or in relationships, because if you've got moons in different elements, you're going to need very different care of your emotional being. And that can be quite hard to understand. So I'm going to share the screen now. So first of all, we go back to our Star Wisdom syllabus. You can see the moon sits in the self-identity circle because it's about our emotional body. So the moon sits in the neutral zone of the Star Wisdom syllabus. So this is these are techniques that are very intuitive. It's like once you've understood the basic concept of where in the chart, the star map you're looking, then you need to use your intuition to really understand what that means. So here again are the 3 ego planets, and we've already looked at the Sun and Saturn. The symbol for the moon looks like a crescent moon, and in my chart, it's in the sign of Cancer, which is actually the sign that the moon rules. That's where it feels most at home, in the sign of Cancer. So this means, so this is a water sign, obviously. So my moon, my emotional being is very watery. It's like if I need to ease out in some way, a bath is really good for me, or being by the sea or being by water. I find that very soothing and very comforting. Sometimes I might just need to cry because I feel really upset about something. It's like, if somebody provokes me and I get and they're angry with me, I tend to cry rather than react back with anger. A moon in a fire sign is much more likely to be reactive. It's much more likely to be quite sparky and possibly confrontational. And to appease a moon in a fire sign, you may need to go and do something adventurous or something active, something is stimulating. A moon in an earth sign is going to need more physical comforts. They tend to be quite practical with their emotions. So rather than being emotional, they go and do something to channel their emotional state into something physical like cooking or gardening or something like that. So it's useful to know if somebody has a moon in an earth sign, because they're going to need quite a different response to somebody with a moon in a water sign. They might need a hug, or they might just need some space to go and do something practical with their hands. And also for me, as a water moon, I can find that very confusing to be with somebody who has a moon in an earth sign, because I'm like, well, don't you feel anything? You're just off doing something practical. Or you could have a moon in an air sign, and they're more likely to think about what they're feeling. They might need to talk about it. I don't particularly want to talk about what I'm feeling. I just want to feel it and, have a good cry or, whatever. Whereas an air sign, an air moon, might really need to talk about it endlessly, especially if there's moon in Gemini. And this can be really difficult for me as well, because I'm like, you're just being so detached. It feels so detached to me. So you can see that it's really useful to know at least what elements people's moons are. If you're a parent and you have a child with an earth moon and they're upset about something, much better to say, come on, let's go and make some cakes, or let's go and do some gardening. Or if you have a child who has an air moon, you can say, okay, let's just sit down and you talk to me about it. Tell me about what is bothering you. Or a moon in a fire sign, you say, come, let's go on off and have an adventure. Let's go and do something active and exciting. And equally, in a relationship, it's so important to know where the other person's, what element the other person's moon sign is, because there's one thing that is really difficult. Like, I was married to a man who had moon in Gemini, and I couldn't bear it. It's just this endless having to analyze and talk about how he felt. And I just wanted to cry or just, go and have a bath or whatever. But I had to listen to all this. And I found that really difficult. So, very useful to know where somebody's, what element at least somebody's moon sign is in. And remember what I said about the moon being about history and roots and the unconscious. So the moon rules the fourth house, which we don't see it as a number 4. That's the start. The IC marks the start of the fourth house. And this is the house of home and roots and the unconscious. So this is where we feel connected to everybody else. We feel at one, like we're part of the collective unconscious. People who have planets on the IC are often very aware of what is going on amongst everyone else around them because they can feel this collective unconscious. Moon in Cancer, like I have, is can be very intuitive, can be very perceptive, because Cancer rules the fourth house, the collective unconscious. So I can be very perceptive to what's actually going on for somebody. I can tell whether something's not quite right, even if they don't say anything. It's in the intuitive quadrant. So it's very, moon in Cancer is very intuitive. And the moon in general can be very intuitive, unless you're in a very dominant air or earth sign. So the moon is going to teach us about what is in the shadow areas of the chart, what is hiding, what tends to live in the unconscious, what isn't coming out into the world like the sun and the sovereignty. And there's several places, there's 5 places where planets can hide, where they can retreat into the shadows and not be so visible. And we're going to look through each one of these in turn. So the first one is to look at the chart as a cave. And the entrance to the cave is at the DC, the descendant. Any planets that sit at the entrance of the cave are like the gatekeepers of the chart. And because it's the entrance, it's where people first meet us and where we come out to meet other people. So you can see I've got Uranus at the entrance of my cave. You're always looking at the planet that's nearest to the DC. If you don't have any planets in the right-hand side of your chart, then you could feel quite vulnerable and quite exposed because there's no gatekeeper. So when people first meet me, they meet Uranus, bit eccentric, bit different, bit unusual, into astrology, yeah, all things are a bit weird. But in terms of what's hidden, we need to look at the back of the cave, this area here, because anybody that comes in to meet us, in order to get to the back of the cave, they've got to deal with all this lot in order to get there. Now, I don't actually have anything at the back of my cave. I mean, this little group is fairly near the back of the cave, and I am a little bit more reticent about really revealing who I am. I can be quite private in that way. Whereas my moon is right over here at the entrance to the cave. So it's almost like I wear my heart on my sleeve. And when people meet me, they're much more likely to meet my emotional being than they are my sun. So look at the charts and look for anything that is sitting in the very back of the cave, particularly if it's the sun or the moon, because anybody with the sun or the moon at the back of the cave is going to be very private. They're not going to let people in easily. You've got to deal with all this lot first before they'll let you into the back. They're going to suss you out first. So then the next thing we're looking at are what we call intercepted signs and planets. Now, not everybody has intercepted signs in their chart, and some people can have more than one. It really depends on the latitude that you were born at. If you were born nearer the equator or near in the summer, then you're not likely to have an intercepted sign. But the further north you were born, or in the winter, then you will almost certainly have intercepted signs. And I've seen people born, in Norway and further north even, who can have several intercepted signs. And what it means is that the sign, so in this case, Libra, sits entirely within a house. There are no house cusps in Libra. There's a house cup here in Virgo, and there's another one in Scorpio, but there's nothing in Libra. If a sign is intercepted, that usually means there'll be another sign that has two house cusps. So you can see in Sagittarius, I have two house cusps. And intercepted signs always have an opposite intercepted sign, because the house cusps are all opposite each other. Now, I don't actually have any planets in my intercepted signs, but if I did, or if someone does, it's really hard for that planet to be seen in the outside world, because the planets find their way into the external environment through the house cusps. The houses represent the external environment. So if I did have a planet sitting in Libra, it would have no way out to express itself. So it'd be quite hidden. And I would have to look to see if there's any aspects going from it to a different planet that wasn't intercepted. Okay, so this planet can't express itself through Libra, through that house, through the 8th house. It has to come down and express itself through this planet, through a different house. So I don't have any intercepted planets, but you'll find that plenty of people do. And when it's an intercepted sun, this can be quite challenging, because it can be quite difficult for that person to express themselves in the outside world. Intercepted Mercury can be really difficult, because Mercury is about our communication. And if there's no way out into the world to communicate, it's often that it's almost like people can't hear you, or they misread you, or it's like you can talk and then you realize that they weren't even listening. Like, it was almost like you hadn't spoken. And so Mercury definitely has to find a way out through another planet. And then we're going to look at unaspected planets. So as it is, I don't have an unaspected planet. An unaspected planet would just be sitting there on its own with no aspects. However, I do have two planets that, although they're connected to each other, they don't connect to the rest of the chart. So Neptune only has an aspect to Uranus. Uranus only has an aspect to Neptune. Neither of them connect to the rest of the chart. And what happens here is that you're either living in the bulk of the chart, or you drop out into the unaspected planet. So, for example, somebody who has an unaspected Mars, they can go into hyperdrive action, activity with that Mars, and then drop back into the rest of the chart and get on with the rest of their life. So an unaspected Saturn can go into control or organizing. And then when that bit's done, it'll drop back into the rest of the chart. And if you talk to people who have unaspected planets, or like me, an unaspected pair of planets, they're usually very, very aware of this transition from the bulk of the chart into the unaspected planet, even though they don't know that that is what is happening. So an unaspected planet can be quite hidden unless it is the planet that is being activated and lived out in. If the person is in the rest of the chart, then that planet will be hidden. And then I want to look at the areas of the houses. because this is really important in terms of how a planet expresses itself. So these two big black arrows represent the house cusps, so just two house cusps. And the energy is always flowing this way. It flows anti-clockwise, remember? And you'll notice in each house that there are two little black marks. They're not actually arrows, they're just little black marks. There's a longer one and a shorter one. The longer one comes first in the direction of flow. And these two marks split the house up into three areas. And weirdly, is a cardinal area, a fixed area, and a mutable area. So planets in the cardinal area tend to be quite dynamic and active. Planets in the fixed area are more settled and more working and building. And planets in the mutable area are basically looking to the next house and going, oh, actually, we're going to have a change of theme. We're going to do something different. Planets that sit on a house cusp are very out in the world. You know, the house cusps are the way out into the world. So a planet that sits on a house cusp, like we said in Saturn, is very dominant. And the planet that sits the first section of the house, the cardinal zone, will be quite dominant. But then they become more introverted. Now, this first mark, the bigger of the two little black marks, is called the balance point. So where the planets are very out at the cusps, then the energy starts to draw in. And at the balance point, it's where the energy is out and in is equal. So it's balanced. So it can be quite out or it can be quite in. But then as the energy drops down further through the house, you come to the little black mark, which I've now marked in red, and this is called the invert point. And this is very internal. Any planet that sits here is not operating directly into the outside world. It's operating internally. It's not visible in the outside world. It's an inner process that is going on. And then as the energy moves back up to the cusp, so the planets become more outward again, but there's still another challenging area to go through where a planet can be quite hidden or reserved. And those are the stress zones. So the last little bit of the house before the cusp, not the last degree usually, 1 or 2 degrees, that's usually the cusp, but the few degrees before the house cusp is called the stress zone. And it's a bit like when you're climbing a mountain and you're climbing up the mountain and it's all brilliant and it's fantastic, but then you start to get really tired. It's like, God, it seems an awfully long way up to that cusp, up to the top of the mountain. And you can get to a point where even the path is gone and you're on your hands and knees scrabbling. And all you can do is just keep putting one foot in front of the other because you can't see the top and you're beginning to wonder if you're ever going to get there. And all you can do is just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And then you look up, oh, look, there's the top. There's the house cusp. Oh, I can do that. And then you got out of the stress zone and you're in that little clear area that is part of the cusp. So that stress zone is that I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I've got the energy to get to the top of the mountain. And all you have to do is just keep putting one foot in front of the other. So any planets that sit in the stress zone are struggling and maybe quite reserved or quite hidden. For your homework, I want you to make a list of all the planets that are hiding at the back of the cave. or any planets that might be hiding at the back of the cave, the planets on or near the invert points, so they're either on the invert point or within 1 or 2 degrees of it, the planets in the stress zones, any intercepted planets, and any unaspected planets. And then for your own chart, really look at these planets and see how they're not very active in the outside world. The vast majority of people actually only have 2 or 3 planets that are very, very dominant in the outside world, that are very visible. Most planets are sort of operating internally, or they're having to find another way out into the world, or they might be quite stressed. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.